You got to get out of your head the idea that these elite private schools are opening their doors to kiddos once the voucher turns on. That's just not what happens. The schools that are taking lower income kids are poorly run operations, and that's why the results are so terrible.
So today we have we've been wanting to do this conversation for a long time, and it's long overdue. Professor Joshua Cowan is a professor of
Cowan.
Gosh, Cowan.
You did it again, buddy.
Professor Cowan is a professor of education policy at Michigan State University. He was also the founding director and co-director of the Education Policy and Innovation Collaborative, EPIC, from 2016 to 2020, and he's going to be talking to us about school choice, quote unquote. School privatization is what we refer to it as, and he comes to this issue from a very interesting perspective, which is that he used to be a proponent. He used to think that this would be what is going to actually be beneficial for students, and so he studied it, right? Like, he actually looked at the results and he said, you know what? It doesn't seem to be the case that it's beneficial. So really excited to talk to Professor Cowan. Thank you for taking the time this morning.
Yeah, happy to be here, guys.
So talk to us about your background and believing for a time that school choice, the reform movement was really, the school reform, education reform movement was really going to be the thing that improves education for students in this country.
Yeah, so a little bit of background. The education reform movement has always been primarily based in and driven by folks who are focusing on improving schools in large urban environments. And a lot of the sort of so-called education reform policies and plans to come out of those environments have been based on something called the market approach to education, meaning that we should treat education like like any other sort of market type set of problems, whether it's dealing with teachers and teacher improvement, whether it's dealing with supply of certain products. In this case, if you think about education in a product, then schools are the firms delivering that product. And the idea there was competition's really, really important in a capitalist driven market. And so what we need to do is create situations where schools compete with each other for scarce resources. And that will, sort of, the phrase goes, rising tide will lift all boats, every school will improve. There's a number of problems with a lot of those different approaches, and some have been more successful, frankly, than others. But the specific problem of how to improve schools through this general bag of tools called school choice. There's a lot of different types of school choice policy, but the specific one that you raised, the one that we're talking about today, is using tax dollars to send children to, or to pay for kids in private school, will in the long run create competition between public and private schools, thus benefiting everybody. That's the idea behind these things. Mm-hmm. And about 20 years ago, 25 really, these policies started to get trotted out in environments, mostly around my neck of the woods: Milwaukee, Cleveland, Ohio, Washington, D.C. 20 years ago. I don't know that I was ever sort of, strongly in favor of them, but early in my career, these were kind of a hot thing to try to study. And I did, and I was part of a number of teams looking at those. And as these school privatization efforts have grown from these kind of small pilot type programs in places like Milwaukee, Cleveland, even to Washington, D.C., to statewide programs like those that are being talked about all over states today, particularly in the South, where you guys are, states like Louisiana, states like Tennessee, states like Arkansas. We've seen some of the most devastating academic results for kids we've ever seen anywhere in the education research record. On top of that, these programs aren't even really offering choice. What they're really doing is about 3/4 of users for these private schools getting taxpayer dollars were already in private school to begin with. So that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Right. And so I want you to kind of lay out the results, but if you could dive in a little bit more into the, you know, the case for it, and some of the data that they marshal when they marshal out data. The thing that I have found in Alabama is this has been a recurring topic. I think over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a big push to try to do an expansive kind of universal school choice in the state legislature. And the thing that I have found most surprising is that here in Alabama, they just don't even bother with actually presenting anybody with data. I mean, there's data out there that you could kind of manipulate and say like, oh, doesn't this look good? But they just don't even bother to do that. And that's been the most surprising thing to me as we've gone through 2 or 3 cycles of this. There are places, like you said, that have done this on a pretty big scale, and so we have results that we can look at. Why aren't they telling us the results? That's
because the results are pretty terrible. And again, 20 years ago, that wasn't necessarily the case. And there was still at that time strong belief on the other side of this question among the folks pushing these type of bills that the results would make things look really good. And so what they did at the time was they wrote into legislation, they wrote into these bills very, very expansive accountability systems that were very similar to what public schools had to deal with. This was the era of No Child Left Behind, where test scores were really important to public school accountability. And following that, taxpayer-funded private schools were also required to do the same thing. None of that's true anymore. And the reason is, the public schools still have to test their kids, but what's going on here is the results have been horrific over the last decade. Again, some of the worst we've ever seen. And so rather than try to kind of mess with that and create new kind of, there are still some effort to create some type of data that backs these things. But increasingly what's going on is that they just don't even bother to, they say, you know, as long as parents are happy with these private schools, the taxpayers don't have to know what's going on inside them. We'll just keep the accountability for the public schools where the vast majority of kids go. That's really what's going on today.
Yeah, I was going to jump in real quick to say that's what I'm seeing as well from the proponents of quote unquote school choice here in Alabama, is they are relying on this market, ideology that you opened the segment with, that, you know, it's not so much about the results and whether or not, you know, academic scores are improving for, you know, these kids or that kids. Right, yeah. Right. And so that's really, you know, an interesting shift. And I think, as you pointed to, the evidence isn't on their side, right? So if it's not on your side, you can't refer to it. And I think that market ideology is something that, you know, both political parties have embraced to varying degrees over the past couple decades. And it's something that has been internalized by even those in education to a large degree. Yeah. But yeah, I just really wanted to emphasize that. I think that is a huge piece of this, the conception of public education as anything else, as a product to be sold on the capitalist marketplace, just like, you know, any widget or car or anything you could imagine. And
it's important to understand that even on those terms, these voucher systems fail. Like that's what even in this space that they have not been able to perform well. And there's the main reason for that. And this is, if you take nothing else from this conversation today, the most important thing to understand is that the vast majority of beneficiaries for these school privatization plans were already in private school to begin with. It's about 3/4. Okay. They're just in October, a few weeks ago, when most recent numbers came out in Arkansas, which was the most recent state in a long line to report these numbers. 95% of children using the voucher system that just got passed in Arkansas had never been in an Arkansas public school. And those numbers are similar all over the country when this happens. Wow. It's just the tiny number of kids who are able to transfer from public to private school. Those are the kids that they're kind of staking all of this on. And, you know, the honest case, you asked me about the case for this at the beginning. The honest case for it is that there are some folks who are never going to send their children to public school, and they shouldn't have to pay private school tuition. But they're doing that right now. They can afford private school tuition, so they're sending their kids to private school, and the taxpayer should now come in and pick up the dime. Like that's, at the end of the day, that's the honest argument. We could debate that, right? I mean, we could have that debate. But that's not actually the debate these folks want to engage in. They want to make it about public school failure. They want to say it's about opportunity and freedom and choice. Listen, I don't know how many of your listeners are living in rural communities, but look around. How many private schools are there, right? So if I tell you that 3/4 or more of users of these programs have never been in a public school, were already paying tuition for private school before asking taxpayers to pick up the check, this is not going to benefit most communities, and they know that. And that's why the plan here is push these bills through, very little transparency, very little accountability. It's a playbook that's being followed in state after state after state.
Right. It's, the vast majority of this program is basically a handout to the affluent. But then, and I've heard people actually say this I actually just saw a video this morning, in fact, on Twitter. There's this conservative radio host talking to an opponent of the school privatization schemes. And they said something similar, this opponent of these programs. And so the conservative radio host said, so what you're saying is those 20% don't matter. Can you talk to us about that 20%, or in Arkansas, that 5%? What does this program do for them? Is maybe what we have to do to help this 5% is even lower than I had realized, but 5%, we have to throw millions of dollars to the wealthy to help this 5%. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, no, those are the kids who are hurt worse by these programs than anyone else. So it's what I've said in other spaces is that these voucher systems are the education equivalent of predatory lending. Okay. What happens is that they promise that this is, like, nobody is saying that public schools don't have shortcomings, and nobody is saying that there's substantial room for improvement in public school communities. Like, that's there's a lot of folks working every day to do that. And so what these voucher proponents, what these voucher lobbyists come in with a set of nationally written talking points into each state. It's usually the same. And I've been talking to folks all over the country, and I'm just overwhelmed sometimes by how they just blast talking points into Alabama, Tennessee, to Arkansas, usually written by some DC think tanks, guys I know. And what they're trying to do is prey on people's frustration, and in some cases very understandable frustration with their experience in public school, and say, we're offering you an alternative. What they're not telling you is that overwhelmingly for the kids who manage to get in, that alternative is far worse. And they're not telling you how hard it is to get in the first place. These voucher systems allow private schools, to discriminate at will, and to, even if it's not meeting, say, a legal form of discrimination, they're allowed to just reject any applicants they want. They're allowed to ask any child they want to leave at any given period of time. And so part of this issue of, the overwhelmingly large number of beneficiaries that are in private schools are the beneficiaries of these voucher systems, part of the issue there is that they've already gotten in. And so what happens is you'll see Governor Ivey, you'll see Governor Lee in Tennessee, you'll see Governor Sanders in Arkansas. They'll come out there and they'll say, my plan has, X percent of kids in our state will be eligible. Well, there's a big difference between eligible and access. Okay. And what they're not telling you is that just because the state is saying we'll cut a check for your family, they're not telling you the second part, which is if you can get into private school. And even if your kid meets the academic requirements, there still may be no room at the end. And that's why that number is so high for the current number of voucher users who are already in private school. Those are the kids who got in, managed to get through the door, managed to stay, and the state is now coming in and offering to pick up the check. And that's just really what's going on.
And so what about the academic results? What do those look like?
So let's take Louisiana nearby. I know you got some listeners in the New Orleans area. So Louisiana built its voucher system in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, and then over the last 10 years has scaled it up to a statewide program. Louisiana results for kids who transferred from public to private school in that state overwhelmingly got shuttled into, because for a period of time, the state did require, it doesn't any longer, but for a period of time, it did require private schools that were going to take these taxpayer bailouts had to submit to some oversight as well. And so they got ranked on a report card. So overwhelmingly, the kids who moved from public to private school using the Louisiana vouchers went to DNF rated private schools. And what we saw is that on average, their test scores dropped. The technical number is 0.4 of a standard deviation. 0.4 of a standard deviation is about twice what COVID-19 has done to test scores more recently, and it's nearly 3 times what Hurricane Katrina did to test scores in Louisiana in 2005 for kids who stayed there and who were affected by that storm. These are catastrophic academic results for kids who transfer, and the reason again gets back to this issue of those DNF schools. The schools that want these taxpayer bailouts, they're what I call subprime private schools, very similar to kind of predatory lenders in the mortgage sector. They're financially distressed. They're not very good at what they do. So remember when I said that on their own terms, the market approach has showed that these systems fail? That's why. So under normal circumstances, these schools would go under. And what they're doing is coming in and they're taking these taxpayer dollars as a lifeline. And the results for kids who transfer into them are that they show just how devastating and how bad these schools are at actually teaching children. The good schools, there are a lot of really great private schools out there. But overwhelmingly, they don't want anything to do with these things. And think about it. Like, who's going to have room if the state starts kind of coming in, picking up the tab and says, we're going to allow some kids to transfer from public to private school? It's the schools that already have room. Why do they have room? Why are they financially distressed? It's because they're not very good. The schools that have the waiting list, the schools that have the very high requirements that most kids can't get into, those schools are full. And those are the ones that do benefit down the line, by the way, when vouchers scale up, like all these plans are asking them to do. Then those users do get the tax break. But for the children that do transfer from public to private school, that's why the results are so terrible. I'm not overstating this. This is really on par with, and in some cases in Louisiana, exceeding what COVID-19 did and what Hurricane Katrina did to test scores.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Wow. I had no idea that I had not heard that information. That is wild. Because these are the people that the whole argument is staked on, right? Because obviously the affluent, middle or upper middle class people who are already paying for private school tuition, they're not a very sympathetic kind of figure. So they don't want to make the honest argument that you were talking about earlier, where, we think that, we upper class people think that the rest of you who are, statistically likely to have less money than I do, we think you should pay for my school too. In addition to the public school, you should pay for private school. That's not it's not an argument that's going to be easy to win. So they try to stake this virtuous position of, I want to help, poor and black students get out of failing public schools. But you're saying that the data actually shows that people who take advantage of the voucher program, who have not been in private schools,
right,
their academic results actually decrease by more than the decrease from COVID.
Right. It's the education equivalent of predatory lending. That's exactly right. The kids who are already in the elite private schools, they are getting vouchers now. That's an important piece of this conversation, that these universal voucher systems like that are being proposed in each state, including your own, they are saying we're going to give money to these elite private schools too. But what they're not saying is that these elite private schools have to accept any new children. They're just simply saying we're going to underwrite the tuition for the kids who are there. So which schools still have space and which schools are able to accept more children coming from public to private school? It's these subprime providers. Often, some of these schools are actually what I call pop-up schools. They come into the market once vouchers the voucher cash flow turns on. They open up. It turns out it's really hard to run a school. Not a lot of people are actually very good at it. And so they come in, think about PPP during COVID, the small business cash that was turned on during COVID. How many of you got a cousin or something who it's just kind of like, I didn't know that guy had a business, and all of a sudden he's got a
Right.
business, and he got a $25,000 bailout saying for his small business because he was going to just about start one, and then COVID hit. I literally got a cousin who did that. That's what these schools do when vouchers come in. There's a number of these schools that come in. Again, they're not very good at it. So the types of schools that kids attend when they when voucher systems do come into the state are, number one, these financially distressed subprime schools that are already existing, that are barely hanging on. They'll take any kids that come in, and it's not because they're benevolent, it's because they need the money. The other group of schools are those pop-up schools that flood the market. I spent a lot of time studying this issue in Wisconsin. 40% of schools, private schools taking voucher funds, have closed since that program began in 1990. It's the oldest one in the country. 40% of schools have closed, even with the taxpayer bailout. And the average time to failure for the schools that did get that money that closed was less than 4 years. They made it 4 years. Now think about a kid coming in first grade, second grade, kindergarten, whatever. That means that kid's entire academic life in elementary school, they could enter that school and the school could shut down before they even finished fifth grade. That's why these results are so bad. I think sometimes when I talk to folks, not necessarily you guys, but I talk to folks in other sectors and they're like, but this can't be true. How can these academic results be so bad? The reason is you got to get out of your head the idea that these elite private schools are opening their doors to kiddos once the voucher turns on. That's just not what happens. The schools that are taking the kids most in need, like lower income kids, the vulnerable kids, are themselves poorly run operations, often that close, and that's why the results are so terrible.
Right.
So,
I mean, I was just going to say that's so true. I mean, there's a misconception, that folks will be allowed into these elite academies when in reality you're going to be at Bubba's Bible School at the strip mall that just popped up, right? And has God knows who teaching, classrooms, if there's teaching even happening. It's just really it's shocking. And so one thing I really wanted to ask you about is, so we've talked about the folks, this minority of folks who are going to potentially benefit from this program, they think, only until they see the results. We know the majority of folks benefiting from the program are just getting a handout. But what about all of us folks that are left behind in the public school system? How does this actually impact the public schools, once these programs are intact?
It's a good question. So there's two things to take on here. So the first is, how does this affect, say, the academic outcomes of the kids who stay? And the reason that's an important question to address is that this market theory behind these improvements would also suggest that academic outcomes will improve if there's competition.
Right.
And I will say that oddly enough, the evidence that that vouchers, quote unquote, work is better for what happens to the kids who are left behind than it is for the kids who are actually used. Only in the sense that we see these very slight upticks sometimes in Florida's Florida's where most of these results have been found. We do see these slight upticks in test scores as a result of what's called competitive threats. When a voucher system starts to underwrite private schools in a certain district's area, sometimes those districts' test scores improve for the kids who stay. That's only true, however, and this is a very big exception, very big caveat. It's only true in districts that stand to lose the most money. So when you hear voucher, it turns out defunding public schools is a really unpopular position. Left, right, most people don't want their public schools defunded in their communities. And so there's been a lot of effort made by the voucher lobbyist groups right now to say, no, these vouchers, they don't take money from public schools. And then they'll say in the same breath, but there are competitive effects that show public schools improve with academics. And I will say they can't have it both ways. So what the data show is that it's only true that there are competitive effects in extremely vulnerable lower income communities that stand to lose the most dollars from voucher systems coming in. That's number one. Okay. Number two is over time. So the dollars that get lost when vouchers are become law in any given state are the state portion of funding for local public schools. Remember when I said 3/4 or more of users from these voucher systems were never in public school to begin with. So what that means is that most individual districts in your state, for example, they're not going to lose the money necessarily because they're losing tons and tons of children from their schools going to all these private schools in that area. We've already talked today about how that does not happen. What does happen is states can't afford to pay for two separate sectors of education. And so right now, private individuals who can already afford private tuition on their own are paying their own tuition. And what the Governor Ivey's plan would do, what Governor Lee's plan north of you guys would do, what's going on in Arkansas, what's going on in Louisiana and elsewhere is simply saying, okay, we're going to come in as a taxpayer and pick up the tab for what's already being paid for on the private sector currently. The state can't afford to do that in the long run. And so the way it pays for it is by draining portions of state aid to local school districts. So that's where local school districts start to lose the most amount of money is and have to rely entirely on their own local revenue base. So that, depending on your political orientation, may sound like a good thing, but it turns out that if you go ask both school district leaders, community leaders, mayors, city councils, families who are paying attention to this stuff, they'll all tell you that the state portion of education funding is incredibly important to their districts. And the main reason is that the economy changes, it ebbs, it flows. Some dollars, some years are lean years, some years are fat years. Districts can't have this fluctuating source of revenue. What the state portion does is it evens things out. It allows districts to plan. That all goes away when vouchers come to town.
Wow. So trying to be a devil's advocate, I could imagine somebody saying, okay, so some of these schools close down after 4 years. That's competition. And given enough time, maybe given 20 years or something, then then some of the elite schools will actually begin to respond to the incentive to try to take more of these students in. They'll try to expand, or some of these other pop-up schools will get better and become something like an elite school. Have we seen any of that happen in any of these in any of these instances?
No, the only data that we have is tracked to these schools for about 4 years, and so anything past 4 years, we don't know how the academic outcomes might be. But I will tell you though that and again, that's partly because states have just stopped tracking those for these larger voucher systems. None of the voucher bills passed in the last 2 years nationally have included any type of oversight provisions that would allow us to answer those long-term questions that you just asked. The thing we do know, just in terms of like the performance of the school and the kids going into them and that kind of thing, the thing we do know for sure though is that it's over that same period of time that all of the bills come due at the state level. So what's and this is probably going on. I haven't sort of followed the individual political debates going on in your legislature right now, but the common trick is to create what's called a hold harmless type approach to funding these voucher systems in the first couple of years, and they do that because politicians on either side of the aisle and legislatures don't like to vote on bills that will take dollars from their communities. And so to get enough votes, even among Republicans, what ends up happening is the state will carve out these kind of, again, what they're called hold harmless provisions. We're not going to defund local districts for a while. We're just going to pay for these voucher systems for the next 3 or 4 years out of other pieces of our general revenue fund. That only is doable for 3 or 4 years. It's just like putting the charge onto a credit card, right? Like you can avoid paying for all of it at once. You can put a new big screen TV on an installment plan or whatever, but at some point you got to pay, and usually it comes with interest. And that's what happens here. So the long run question, to that devil's advocate is, okay, it's well, we do know that it's true that these elite private schools over time start to open more of their doors, but it's not that they're opening them to new kids. It's just that more and more of those children become eligible to take a voucher because over time the enrollment caps on participation go up and up and up and up, and eventually just to go, like in Florida, go to anybody who wants a voucher, even if you are already in private school paying yourself for 8 years. When that happens, that's when the state just begins to not be able to afford to pay for both. And that's where spending on local districts goes down, local communities goes down. And that's when the check comes due.
Wow. I don't have any other questions, Adam. Is there anything else that you wanted to ask him?
Yeah, I guess my final question would be, do you have any parting words for people who are working in public education, who have kids in public education, people who believe in public education and want to see it improved and defended, whether it's here in Alabama or elsewhere? Do you have any final words for those of us who really want to win this fight?
Yeah, I'd say just keep up the fight. Listen, every family has things that they would like to make better for themselves in their house, the people that they love, the people that love them. We all have things that we want to work on. In public schools, there are things that we need to keep working on. No one is saying that these schools are perfect. Right. We're also not saying that the approach is to just stop funding them, destroy the whole household, and move out and move in with some mistress who's gonna offer us a good time for 6 months and then kick us out too. That's basically what these bills are doing. So I would say, listen, don't buy the pitch from the out-of-state snake oil salesman. I've heard it in every state right now. It's all the same. These are really well-coordinated things. The results are terrible. These are bills that are intended almost exclusively to benefit families who are already in private schools. And what that's going to mean, though, too, by the way, is that it's still, no matter if this bill passes in your state, it's still going to be true, no matter what, that the vast majority of children in Alabama are going to be learning in Alabama public schools. And so all this bill will do is cut new checks and new tax breaks for families that are in Alabama private schools, and leave the public schools to clean up the what's left with less money over time. And then the last thing I would say, go ahead.
No, well, you can say that and then and wrap up with this. I feel like this would be a good place to kind of end it on. You mentioned that there were, in select instances, minor improvements from the competitive effect in public schools, and in very, it's a very small group that this affects, but there is that. What are studying education policy? I don't know if you have been just your bailiwick has been school choice, and I want to assess its effect, or if it's been generally education policy. But if it's the latter, what are some things that you have seen across the country that have been implemented that have actually been proven on a large scale to make education and academic results better for the students?
Tutoring, summer school, professional development for teachers. Listen, and here, this isn't a satisfactory answer to some folks, but Gospel Matthew tells me that where my treasure is, there my heart will be also. You have to fund public schools. So those competitive effects that we talked about in the voucher system, they're tiny. I'm not going to bore you with the math numbers, but they're tiny. They're about 2/10 of the size of just directly investing in those public schools in the first place. And that's a really important piece of this. So I appreciate you giving me the chance to follow up on that. Those competitive effects that do exist in those voucher systems are, again, about 20% the size of just giving the schools more dollars to invest in the first place. So if improving public schools is our goal, which I think it should be, and then simply giving them the resources to improve rather than funding private schools for kids who are already there is actually much more effective on its own terms. And sometimes when I talk to folks, they're looking for me to say a really clever new scheme to improve outcomes. And we have a few data points that show, again, things like tutoring, things like summer school, things like professional development for teachers do work, but all those things cost money. And so there's there's no substitute for just simply paying for the things that are important to you. Budgets are moral documents. So it tells what we decide to fund with our dollars, whether it's in education, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in food for families. That's another thing. My governor just passed last year a universal school meals bill giving food to kiddos. When that happens, not only do their test scores improve, not only do they not get bullied if they have to kind of wait in a line for food, but turns out things like local grocery prices go down because grocery stores have to kind of lower their prices to compete with schools for those free lunches. Like, it benefits everybody. None of that's possible if you're going to be sending taxpayer dollars to private school tuition for kids who are already there.
I'm sorry, I've got one more follow-up. Finland is really, as I understand it, lauded for its public education system. And one of the things that Finland does is they ban private school. There's no private schools in Finland, if I'm remembering correctly. You can't. It's all public education. There are some people who say that because of that, then that means that all the hoity-toity people have to go to public schools, and so they have more of an incentive to actually make sure the people with power in the community have the incentive to make sure that the public schools are better in Finland because their kids have to go there. Is there any merit to that? Have you looked into that at all?
Well, I think again, it goes back to the resources involved there, right? If everybody's children are going there, then that means that the entire amount of resources spent on education is going to support those public schools, and everybody's in this together. That's just not the model that these voucher systems are planning here, and the results show.
All right. Professor Cowan, thank you for your time. You've been very generous.
Yes, you have been very generous, and have really enjoyed it, and will be sharing with every educator I know in Alabama.
Yep. Sounds good. Best of luck, guys.
Appreciate you.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I mean now the movement's dead. I mean, they're going to be done because these are people that are like all facts and logic and facts don't care about your feelings. So I mean, we're
once
not going to
they listen to this, it's going to end the debate. It's going to end
the debate. Yeah, we're not going to hear about school choice anymore in Alabama.
We hope.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.